My wife called me a pathetic loser with a fishing rod, then left me, but when I caught something worth millions, she came crawling back. You know that feeling when your whole world just collapses like a house of cards? Yeah, that was me in 2008. Jack Miller, 45 years old, living in Saugatuck right on Lake Michigan shore. Thought I had it all figured out. Steady job at the John Deere plant. Loving wife. Decent savings account. Boy, was I wrong. The pink slip came on a Tuesday. Economic crisis, they said. Plants closing down, they said. Sorry, Jack, but we gotta let you go. 23 years of getting up at 5 a.m., working those factory floors, and it all ended with a handshake and a cardboard box for my desk stuff. But here's the thing about life. It's got a twisted sense of humor. Just when you think you've hit rock bottom, it hands you a shovel. 2 weeks after losing my job, my wife Emily decided she'd had enough of small-town life. And me. Came home Thursday evening to find half our furniture gone and a note on the kitchen counter. Not even a face-to-face conversation. Just a piece of paper saying she was moving to Chicago with her lawyer friend from book club. Yeah, that book club I thought was about discussing romance novels. Turns out some of them were discussing a lot more than books. Emily and I used to sit on our back porch, sharing earbuds connected to my old Walkman, listening to Tom Petty cassettes and dreaming about that little house by the lake. Learning to Fly was our song. We planned it all. White picket fence, wraparound porch. Even picked out names for the cats we'd have. The worst part wasn't betrayal. It was finding out she cleaned out our joint savings account. $37,000 gone. Money we'd saved penny by penny, skipping vacations and eating ramen for months. All those times I'd fix the car myself instead of going to a mechanic. All meaningless in the end. So there I was, 45 years old with nothing but a 1995 Ford Ranger that sounded like it was dying of emphysema and whatever pride I had left, which wasn't much. Had to move out of our house. Couldn't afford the mortgage, and ended up in this tiny apartment above Murphy's hardware store. The place smelled like mildew and cheap coffee, with paper-thin walls that let me hear every argument the couple next door had. The floorboards creaked, the faucet dripped constantly, and the radiator made haunted house noises. But it was what I could afford on unemployment benefits. My brother Tim thought the whole situation was hilarious. He'd drive by in his fancy Silverado and honk the horn. Hey, Jack. He'd yell out the window. Still living the dream? Real supportive family I had there. The guys at O'Malley's Tavern weren't much better. Small-town gossip travels faster than bad news. I'd walk in and conversations would stop. Then the whispers. There goes Jack Miller. Lost his job and his wife in the same month. Poor bastard can't catch a break. I try to laugh it off. Hey, at least I don't have to share the remote anymore, I'd say. But inside, I felt like I was drowning. You ever feel that way? Like you're underwater, looking up at everyone else living their normal lives, and you can't quite reach the surface? The only place that felt like sanctuary was the old pier where my grandpa used to take me fishing when I was a kid. 15-minute drive from town, down a winding road through farmland to a little wooden dock that's probably older than I am. Paint's all peeled off, half the boards warped from Michigan winters, but it's still standing. Grandpa, I was the kind of man they don't make anymore. Served in Korea, worked construction for 40 years, never missed Sunday church. He had these massive hands, scarred from decades of hard work, but could tie the most delicate fishing knots you'd ever seen. I used to watch him for hours, mesmerized. He'd always pack peanut butter and jelly sandwiches cut diagonally because they tasted better that way, and we'd sit on that pier from sunrise to sunset. Sometimes we'd catch enough perch for dinner. Sometimes we'd come home empty-handed. Didn't matter to him either way. Jackie, he'd say, he's the only person who ever called me that. Life's like fishing. Sometimes you wait for hours and nothing happens. But you keep that line in the water because you never know when the big one's going to bite. And usually it happens right when you're ready to pack up and go home. I heard that saying 100 times growing up. Grandpa had this way of making everything sound important. Even when talking about catching bluegill, he'd tell me about the old days when men kept their word and a handshake meant something, when neighbors helped each other without expecting anything back. People nowadays, he'd say, shaking his head, they're always looking for the easy way out. But the best things in life, Jackie, they take patience. They take time. Do good, and it'll come back to you. Maybe not today, but it will come back. After he passed, when I was 20, I kept coming back to that pier. It became my thinking spot, my escape when life got too heavy. The lake has this way of putting things in perspective. It's massive. You can't even see the other side. Makes your problems feel smaller, like tiny ripples on this enormous body of water that's been here for thousands of years. So after everything fell apart, that's where I ended up spending most of my time. Every morning, I'd turn the key in my Ford Ranger and coax it to life. The old beast always started eventually, though it protested with every turn of the engine. I'd grab my tackle box, pack a cooler with whatever cheap beer I could afford, usually Milwaukee's Best, because beggars can't be choosers, and make the familiar drive. Down Main Street, past the closed-down Woolworths and the new Starbucks that nobody in Saugatuck really wanted but somehow always had a line. Past Henderson's farm, where old man Henderson would wave from his tractor, probably wondering why I wasn't at work like normal people. The locals started talking, of course. Jack Miller's out there every day now. They'd say, just sitting by himself, drinking beer and pretending to fish. Poor guy's lost it. Tim was the worst. He'd call just to twist the knife deeper. Jack, you're embarrassing the family. People think you've given up on life. When's the last time you even looked for a job? Truth was, I had been looking. Filled out applications at every business within 50 miles of Saugatuck. Hardware stores, restaurants, construction companies. Nobody was hiring. The economy was in the toilet, and guys like me were a dime a dozen. Middle-aged factory workers with no college degree. Just skills for operating machinery being replaced by computers. But I kept going to the pier. Not because I was giving up, but because it was the only place I could think clearly, where I could remember who I used to be before everything went sideways. The fishing wasn't great, honestly. Most days I catch maybe a couple small perch, nothing worth writing home about. But that wasn't the point. There's something meditative about fishing. The sound of waves lapping against the pier, sunlight dancing on water, the feel of the rod in your hands, forces you to slow down, be present instead of constantly worry about the future or dwelling on the past. Winter turned to spring, and by then I'd started noticing I wasn't the only regular out there. Turns out, early morning fishing attracts a specific type of person. Folks who either have nowhere else to be or are avoiding the places they're supposed to be. There was old Fred, probably 70-something, who'd been fishing the same spot since Nixon was president. He had this beat-up aluminum boat that looked like it survived World War II, and he knew more about Lake Michigan fish patterns than some marine biologists. Fred would arrive every morning at sunrise, rain or shine, with his Detroit Tigers thermos and enough tackle to stock a sporting goods store. The first few weeks, we just nodded at each other, that universal guy acknowledgement that says, I see you, I respect your space, we're cool. But eventually, Fred started sharing his coffee and his theories about why the perch were biting shallow this season. Jack Miller, right? He said one morning, pouring steaming coffee into my cracked travel mug. Heard about the plant closing. Tough break, son, but you picked a good spot to figure things out. Fred had this way of talking that made you feel like he'd seen it all before. Lost jobs, broken marriages, dreams that didn't pan out. Nothing shocked him anymore. He'd just nod and say something like, life's got a way of sorting itself out, long as you don't get in his way too much. Then there was Mike, a Vietnam vet who lived in a converted van and followed good fishing spots around the Great Lakes. Mike was probably in his 60s, with long gray hair usually hidden under a faded Marine Corps cap, and he had this habit of quoting Ernest Hemingway at the strangest moments. You know what Papa Hemingway said about fishing? Mike would ask, casting his line with the precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He said the sea was a great healer. Well, I figure lakes count too. Mike had seen some heavy stuff overseas. You could tell by the way his eyes would sometimes focus on something far beyond the horizon. But he never talked about the war directly. Instead, he'd quote literature and share his homemade beef jerky while we waited for the fish to bite. The funny thing about these early morning fishing sessions was how they became a kind of therapy group without anyone acknowledging it. Three guys who'd all taken different roads to the same quiet place, sharing space and coffee, and the occasional piece of wisdom disguised as small talk. Mike and I started sharing lunches pretty regularly. He'd make these incredible sandwiches on bread. He'd bake himself in his van's tiny oven, and I'd bring extra cans of whatever soup was on sale that week. We'd eat and listen to the water lap against the pier, talking about books and music, and everything except the things that had brought us both to this quiet place. Hemingway wrote about grace under pressure, Mike said one afternoon, watching a bald eagle circle overhead. But I think there's something to be said for grace under boredom, too. Takes a special kind of strength to sit still long enough to figure yourself out. That hit me harder than I expected, because that's exactly what I was doing out there, sitting still long enough to remember who I was underneath all the labels that had been stripped away. Spring moved into early summer, and without really planning it, I'd started becoming what Fred jokingly called the unofficial pier caretaker. When tourists would leave their trash behind, I'd clean it up. When the wooden railings got loose, I'd bring tools from home and tighten them. When Fred's fishing net got tangled in the dock posts, I'd spend an hour carefully working it free. Just small things, but they felt important. "You're different than when you first started coming out here," Fred told me one particularly good morning when we'd all caught our limit. "Quieter, but not in a defeated way. More like you've settled into yourself." People in town had started treating me differently, too. Not mean, but with that careful kindness you use around someone who's broken. The grocery store cashier would give me extra coupons. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, started leaving casseroles outside my door with little notes. "Thought you might enjoy this. No need to return the dish." Sweet gesture, but it reminded me how far I'd fallen. I'd gone from provider to someone people felt sorry for. The loneliness was probably the hardest part. Not just missing Emily, though that hurt like getting punched in the stomach, but missing the feeling of being connected to something bigger than myself. I tried church a few times, thinking maybe I'd find community there. But sitting in those pews, surrounded by families and couples, just made me feel more alone. Everyone was so polite, so careful not to mention Emily or ask too many questions. So I stuck with the pier. As summer progressed, it got busier with weekend fishermen and tourists. But the early morning hours stayed peaceful, like a private club for people who understood that the best fishing happened when the rest of the world was still asleep. I started bringing extra sandwiches and coffee, not just for Fred and Mike, but for whoever else showed up looking like they could use a friend. There was something about sharing food by the water that broke down barriers faster than any small talk ever could. The funny part was, I'd never been what you'd call a people person before. At the plant, I'd kept to myself, did my job, went home. But something about being by the water made conversation easier. Maybe it was because there was no pressure. People came and went, and if you didn't click with someone, they'd be gone in an hour anyway. But here's the thing about helping people. It's addictive in the best possible way. Every small act of kindness felt like I was putting a tiny piece of my self-respect back together. Like I was proving to myself that I still had value, even if I couldn't prove it with a paycheck. I found myself becoming the unofficial guide for anyone who looked lost or confused. Tourists who didn't know how to bait their hooks properly. Kids whose lines got tangled. Elderly folks who needed help carrying their gear. Tim had stopped calling me an embarrassment and started asking about my volunteer work, which made it sound more official than it was. One hot July morning, I heard someone yelling for help from the water. Some guy in a bright red kayak had capsized about 50 yards from shore, and he was clearly panicking. Without thinking, I kicked off my boots and dove in. The water was refreshing after the summer heat, and adrenaline kept me moving strong. The guy was fine, more embarrassed than hurt, but getting him and his kayak back to shore took some effort. By the time we dragged everything onto the beach, a small crowd had gathered, including a woman with a camera who turned out to be from the local newspaper. "That was really something," she said, scribbling notes while the kayaker wrapped himself in someone's beach towel. "Can I get your name for the article? I just want to get back to fishing." But Fred was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "That's Jack Miller," he announced proudly. "Best fishing buddy a guy could ask for, and apparently our local lifeguard too. The whole thing felt blown out of proportion to me. Guy fell in the water. I helped him out. Seemed like basic human decency, not headline news. But the article ran the next week with a photo of me looking like a drowned rat and a headline that read, "Local man saves kayaker." Tim called that evening, and for the first time in months, he sounded genuinely proud. Saw the article online. Mom would have loved that, Jack. She always said you had a good heart. It was a small thing, but hearing approval in my brother's voice instead of disappointment felt better than I'd expected. Maybe I was finally doing something right, even if it wasn't what anyone had planned for me. The rescue story made its way around town quickly. Suddenly, people were treating me differently again, not with pity anymore, but with something closer to respect. Mrs. Henderson stopped leaving casseroles and started inviting me for Sunday dinner instead. The guys at O'Malley's would nod when I walked in, like I'd earned my place back in the community. "You're becoming quite the local celebrity," Mike observed one morning, watching me untangle someone's fishing line from the pier posts. Of course, Papa would say that a man's worth isn't measured by his fame, but by what he does when nobody's watching. That was the thing about Mike's quotes. They always hit exactly when you needed to hear them. And he was right. The stuff that mattered most happened when it was just me and the lake and whatever small task needed doing. As August rolled around, I realized something fundamental had shifted inside me. Those first few weeks after everything fell apart, I'd come to the pier angry and desperate, like I was trying to fish my old life back out of the water. Now I came here because it felt like home. I'd started enjoying my own company. For the first time since I was a teenager, I didn't have to worry about anyone else's needs or opinions. If I wanted to sit on that pier until sunset, I could. If I wanted to eat cereal for dinner, nobody would complain. People started commenting on the overall change in me. Mrs. Henderson mentioned I seemed more settled at the post office. Even Tim noticed during one of our calls, though he couldn't put his finger on what was different. "You sound less angry, Jack," he said, and for once there wasn't judgment in his voice. Not happy exactly, but like you're not fighting with yourself as much. Truth was, I was starting to remember parts of myself that had gotten buried under years of routine and responsibility. The guy who used to build model airplanes in high school, who could spend hours reading about World War II battles, who once drove to Detroit just to see a blues concert because I'd heard the guitarist was incredible. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped doing things just because I enjoyed them. Everything had become about being the kind of man I thought I was supposed to be. But sitting on that pier day after day, I started remembering there were parts of me that existed independently of what others expected. Late one evening in late August, after most of the day fishermen had packed up and gone home, I was cleaning up some trash that had blown against the pier posts. The sun was setting, painting the water gold and orange, and I was taking my time because there was nowhere else I needed to be. That's when I noticed something glinting between the rocks near the water's edge. Probably just a beer bottle cap or a piece of broken glass, but it caught the light in an interesting way. The way evening light could play tricks on you. I'd learned not to trust what I saw during the golden hour. Fred and Mike had already headed home, and the pier was empty except for me and whatever fish were brave enough to bite in the fading light. I finished coiling up someone's abandoned fishing line and started packing my gear. The drive home felt different that night, not because of anything specific that had happened, but because of how ordinary the whole day had been. 6 months ago, ordinary would have felt like failure. Now it felt like peace. I'd spent the day helping a kid from Chicago catch his first perch, sharing coffee with Fred while he told stories about fishing these waters in the 60s, and listening to Mike quote Hemingway about the healing power of moving water. Simple stuff, but it filled the hours in a way that felt meaningful. As I loaded my gear into the Ranger, I glanced back at the pier one more time. The glinting object was still there between the rocks, whatever it was. Probably just trash, I muttered to myself, turning the key and listening to the engine's familiar protest before it grudgingly came to life. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was starting to feel like mine. Not the desperate, angry version of myself that had first started coming to pier, but someone quieter and maybe wiser. Someone who'd learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is show up consistently and see what happens. Back in my apartment, I made a simple dinner and cracked open a beer, thinking about the day and what tomorrow might bring. Maybe Fred would have new theories about why the bass weren't biting. Maybe Mike would share another Hemingway quote that would stick with me for weeks. Maybe some tourists would need help with their tackle box, or some kid would catch their first fish. Lying in bed that night, listening to my neighbors argue through the thin walls, I found myself thinking about that glinting object by the rocks. Probably nothing important. A piece of foil, a lost fishing lure, maybe a bottle cap that caught the light just right. But there was something about the way it had sparkled that stuck with me. Maybe tomorrow will bring something bigger than perch, I said to myself, testing how the word sounded out loud. It was the kind of thing Grandpa Al might have said back when I was young enough to believe that the lake held secrets waiting for the right person to find them. I got up and walked to my small apartment window, looking out toward the direction of the lake in the darkness. Standing there, I realized I was looking forward to morning, not just because it meant another day at the pier, but because it meant another chance to see what the lake might offer up. After all, if life really is like fishing, then I haven't caught my big one yet. Maybe, just maybe, it's still out there waiting for me. Dawn broke over Lake Michigan like God's own alarm clock, and I was already driving toward the pier with that glinting object stuck in my head like a song you can't shake. The ranger grumbled to life on the second try, which felt like a good omen. I'd barely slept, kept thinking about that sparkle between the rocks. Probably just a beer can, I muttered to myself, sipping gas station coffee that tasted like it was brewed in a mechanic's boot. But something about the way it had caught the evening like yesterday kept nagging at me. Grandpa Al always said curiosity was what separated fishermen from philosophers. Fishermen actually went looking for answers. The pier was empty this early, just me and the seagulls having their breakfast argument over some dead fish. Fred and Mike wouldn't show up for another hour, which gave me time to investigate without looking like a complete fool if it turned out to be nothing. I parked the truck and grabbed my tackle box, more for show than anything else. If someone drove by, I'd look like I was just setting up for another day of fishing, not hunting for treasure like some middle-aged pirate. The morning air was crisp, with that clean smell you only get near big water before the world wakes up and starts polluting everything. Walking over to the rocks where I'd seen the glint, I started feeling pretty stupid. Here I was, a 45-year-old unemployed guy, searching through rocks like a kid looking for lucky pennies. But Grandpa used to say that Lake Michigan hid treasure for those who looked carefully, and I've been looking at this lake for months now, without finding much besides small perch and inner peace. The rocks were slippery from the morning dew, and I had to be careful not to slip and end up taking an unexpected swim. That would be just my luck. Survive a whole year of personal disasters only to drown looking for bottle caps. At first, I didn't see anything. Just a usual collection of zebra mussel shells, smooth stones worn down by centuries of waves, and a rusty fishing lure someone had lost years ago. I was about ready to give up and admit I'd been chasing shadows when I spotted again that same glint, but now in the early morning light instead of sunset gold. It was wedged between two larger rocks, about the size of a softball, but heavier than anything had a right to be. The surface was rough and dark, like charcoal, but when I turned it toward the light, these green crystals caught the sun and threw it back like tiny emeralds. Beautiful doesn't even begin to describe it. What the hell? I said out loud, because sometimes you need to hear your own voice to confirm you're not dreaming. The thing was definitely not from around here. I've lived by this lake my whole life, seen every kind of rock the glaciers left behind, and this wasn't one of them. I remembered something Grandpa used to tell me about the old days, when he was young, and the world seemed full of possibilities. He'd say that Lake Michigan was like a giant's pocket. You never knew what might fall out of it. Coins from shipwrecks, pieces of ships themselves, sometimes things that had traveled farther than anyone could imagine. Wrapping the strange rock in my old flannel shirt, the one Emily always said made me look like a lumberjack having a midlife crisis, I carried it back to the truck. It was heavy enough that I had to use both hands, which seemed crazy for something I found just lying around. In my experience, valuable things didn't just sit there waiting for unemployed factory workers to stumble across them. The drive to Chicago took about 2 hours, and I spent most of it talking to myself in the rock like we were old friends. If you turn out to be worth something, I told it, I promise not to blow it all on lottery tickets and bad decisions. I decided to take it to the University of Chicago because that seemed like the kind of place where smart people would know about weird rocks. Plus, it was free, and my budget for professional rock identification was exactly $0 and no cents. The geology building looked like something out of a Harry Potter movie, all Gothic stone and intimidating gargoyles. I felt pretty out of place walking in there with my flannel-wrapped mystery rock, like showing up to a black-tie dinner in coveralls. But the receptionist was nice enough, probably used to dealing with all kinds of crazy people bringing in valuable rocks they'd found in their backyard. I found this by Lake Michigan, I explained, unwrapping my discovery. Thought maybe someone here could tell me what it is. The receptionist's eyes went wide when she saw it, which was either a really good sign or a really bad one. She disappeared into back offices and returned with Dr. Carter, a thin guy with wild Einstein hair and glasses thick enough to start fires. Dr. Carter took one look at my rock and nearly fell over his own feet. He put on some gloves and lifted it carefully, like it might explode or turn into a butterfly. The way he was handling it made me nervous. Either I'd found something incredible or I'd accidentally brought him a chunk of radioactive waste. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, turning it over in his hands and examining those green crystals with a magnifying glass. His voice had that barely controlled excitement scientists get when they think they've stumbled onto something big. I told him about the pier, about how it had been glinting in the evening light, about how I'd almost ignored it thinking it was just trash. He nodded along, but I could tell he was only half listening. Most of his attention was focused on my rock, and he kept making these little humming noises like he was solving a puzzle in his head. "This is extraordinary," he finally said, which in scientist speak probably meant either "holy crap" or "you're about to be very disappointed." He disappeared again, this time taking my rock with him to what I assumed was some kind of rock laboratory. I sat in the waiting area reading old National Geographic magazines and trying not to think about how this was probably going to end with someone politely explaining that I'd found an interesting but worthless chunk of Lake Michigan lake bed. 20 minutes later, Dr. Carter came back with a whole team of people, all wearing the same excited expression you see on kids' faces Christmas morning. I could hear them talking in hushed, urgent voices from whatever lab they'd taken my rock to, and the energy in the air felt like I'd just handed them a winning lottery ticket. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Carter said, and his voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver life-changing news. "What you found is a palisite meteorite. And not just any palisite. This is one of the finest specimens I've ever seen." I sat there for a moment, processing what he'd just said. Meteorite. As in, came from space. As in, traveled millions of miles through the universe just to end up between some rocks on Lake Michigan's shore, waiting for an unemployed factory worker to notice it glinting in the evening light. How much is something like that worth? I asked, because let's be honest, when someone tells you found a meteorite, the first question isn't about its cosmic significance. It's about whether you can finally afford to fix your truck's transmission. Dr. Carter looked at his colleagues, and I could see them having one of those silent conversations people have when they're about to blow your mind. "Well," he said slowly, "pallasites are extremely rare. This specimen, given its size and the quality of these olivine crystals, could be worth considerable money." How considerable are we talking? I pressed, because considerable could mean anything from a nice dinner to a new house. He pulled out a calculator and started doing some math, occasionally glancing back at my rock, my meteorite, like he was double-checking his sanity, based on current market prices for comparable specimens, and factoring in the exceptional quality of this piece. I'd estimate somewhere between $1 and $2 million. I'm pretty sure my brain short-circuited for a moment there. $1 to $2 million. For a rock I'd found while cleaning up trash at a fishing pier. I'd gone from wondering if I could afford groceries next week to potentially being a millionaire, all because I'd been curious about something glinting in the evening light. You might want to have it appraised by someone who specializes in meteorite sales. Dr. Carter continued, apparently not noticing that I'd temporarily stopped functioning as a human being. Christie's Auction House in New York deals with specimens like this. They could give you a more precise valuation. The drive back to Saugatuck was a blur. I had the meteorite wrapped up again, sitting on the passenger seat like the world's most expensive co-pilot. I kept looking over at it, half expecting it to disappear or turn back into an ordinary rock. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like me. Factory workers from small Michigan towns didn't just stumble across million-dollar space rocks. But then I remembered something else Grandpa used to say. The lake gives you what you need when you need it, if you're paying attention. I've been paying attention for months now, showing up every day, taking care of the pier, helping people, being present. Maybe this was the lake's way of saying thank you. $1 to $2 million. I kept repeating those numbers, trying to make them feel real. They didn't. The whole situation was too surreal. 6 months ago, I'd lost everything. Now I was potentially sitting on enough money to buy a house, start a business, maybe even help other people who'd found themselves in the same boat I'd been in. Back in the truck, I unwrapped the meteorite one more time and really looked at it. Those green crystals, olivine, Dr. Carter had called them, caught the afternoon light, and threw it back in patterns that seemed almost alive. This thing had traveled through space for who knows how long, survived entering Earth's atmosphere, and somehow ended up in Lake Michigan waiting for me to find it. If you really are worth what they say, I told it, I'm going to call you Jack's Jackpot. It was a terrible name, but it made me laugh, and I figure if you can't make jokes about finding $1 million space rock, what can you make jokes about? The rest of the drive home, I kept thinking about Grandpa Al and what he'd say about all this. He'd probably remind me that money's just a tool. It's what you do with it that matters. He'd want me to be smart about it. Think it through, make sure I did right by the people who'd helped me when I had nothing. I also thought about Emily, and how she'd probably kick herself for leaving right before I struck it rich. But honestly, I felt more grateful than bitter. If she hadn't left, I might never have started going to the pier every day. I might never have noticed a glinting rock between some stones. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you sets you up for the best thing. By the time I pulled into the parking space behind Murphy's Hardware, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to rush into anything. This meteorite had waited millions of years to be found. It could wait a few more days while I figure out the right thing to do with whatever money it might bring. I carried it upstairs to my little apartment and set it on the kitchen table, where it looked completely out of place among my mismatched dishes and unpaid bills. A piece of outer space, sitting next to my coffee maker and yesterday's newspaper. If that's not proof that life is strange in fiction, I don't know what is. Sitting there looking at it, I thought about all the people at the pier who'd become my friends over the past few months. Fred with his endless coffee and fishing wisdom. Mike with his Hemingway quotes and homemade sandwiches. All the tourists I'd helped. All the small kindnesses that had somehow added up to something bigger. I made myself a sandwich and opened a beer, still staring at my meteorite like it might start talking or float away. The whole thing felt like a dream, but the weight of it on my kitchen table was definitely real. Real enough to change everything, if I let it. This is a chance, I said out loud, testing how the word sounded. But am I ready for what comes next? Outside my window, I could see the direction of the lake in the distance, the same lake that had given me this incredible gift. Tomorrow, I'd have to figure out what to do with it. Tonight, I was just going to sit here with my meteorite and my beer and try to wrap my head around the fact that sometimes, if you keep your line in the water long enough, you really do catch the big one. The next morning, I woke up staring at that meteorite on my kitchen table, still half convinced I'd dreamed the whole thing. But there it was, wrapped in my old flannel shirt, looking like the world's most expensive paperweight. Dr. Carter had given me a business card for someone at Christie's in New York, and I figured it was time to find out if the space rock was really my ticket out of unemployment or just an expensive conversation piece. The phone call to Christie's went better than I'd expected. The woman I spoke with, Sarah something or other, sounded genuinely excited when I described what Dr. Carter had told me. She arranged for me to bring the meteorite to their Manhattan offices for a proper evaluation, and even offered to cover my travel expenses if it turned out to be as valuable as the university thought. 3 days later, I was driving my wheezing Ranger through New York City traffic, feeling like a small-town hick with a space rock riding shotgun. The Christie's building was all marble and intimidation, the kind of place where people probably spent more on lunch than I made in a month back when I had a job. The evaluation took most of the day. They had specialists examining every inch of my meteorite with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. When they finally called me back into the office, Sarah was practically glowing with excitement. "Mr. Miller," she said, "this is one of the finest palisite specimens we've ever had the privilege to evaluate. The olivine crystals are exceptional, and the overall condition is museum quality. We're estimating an auction value of $1.8 million, possibly higher depending on collector interest." $1.8 million. I'd gone from thinking it might be worth a couple $100,000 to nearly $2 million. It was like winning the lottery, except instead of picking numbers, I'd just been curious about something glinting in the evening light. They wanted to put it in their next major auction, scheduled for 3 weeks out. All I had to do was sign some papers, and they'd handle everything else. The reserve price would be set at $1.5 million, which meant even if the bidding was terrible, I'd still walk away with more money than I'd ever imagined having. The drive back to Saugatuck gave me plenty of time to think about what this meant. I could pay off every debt I had, buy a house, start over completely, maybe even help other people who'd found themselves in the same situation I'd been in just a few months ago. It felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. But here's the thing about small towns. They have a way of finding out your business faster than the internet. I'm still not entirely sure how word got out, but by the time I'd been back for 2 days, it seemed like everyone in Saugatuck knew that Jack Miller had found himself $1 million space rock. I suspect it started with Mrs. Henderson, who had this uncanny ability to overhear phone conversations through apartment walls. She probably caught me talking to Christie's and put 2 and 2 together. From there, it would have spread to the post office, the grocery store, and O'Malley's Tavern like wildfire. Small-town gossip networks make the CIA look like amateurs. The first sign that my quiet life was about to get complicated came when Emily called. I hadn't heard from my ex-wife since she'd cleaned out our bank account and moved to Chicago with her lawyer friend. The sound of her voice on the phone brought back a whole flood of emotions I thought I'd dealt with. Her tone was different than I remembered, softer, more careful. She started with small talk about how I was doing, how she'd heard I was spending time fishing, how she hoped I was taking care of myself. But I could hear the real reason for her call lurking underneath all the pleasantries. "Jack," she finally said, "I heard about your discovery. That's incredible luck. I was thinking, maybe we could talk? We were such a good team. You and I, maybe there's a way we could work together on this." Work together. Right. The woman who'd left me a note on the kitchen counter and disappeared with our life. Savings wanted to be partners again now that I'd struck it rich. I found myself thinking about Grandpa Ailes' definition of a team. People who stuck together when things got tough, not people who showed up when things got easy. I told her I'd think about it and hung up, but honestly, there wasn't much to think about. If Emily had wanted to be a team, she could have stuck around when I lost my job instead of bailing at the first sign of trouble. Funny how $1 million meteorite suddenly made her remember all the good times we'd had together. The local business community started circling like sharks smelling blood in the water. Bob Patterson, who owned the biggest car dealership in town, called to invite me to lunch. During our conversation, he casually mentioned that he'd be interested in purchasing my interesting rock for a fair price, maybe $200,000 cash, no hassle with auctions or taxes. "It's a nice stone, Jack," he said with the kind of smile car dealers practice in the mirror. "But you know how these auction houses work. They take their cut, the government takes theirs, and by the time you're done, you might not have much left. Cash in hand is worth 2 promises in the bush." $200,000 for a meteorite worth nearly $2 million. I wasn't a mathematician, but I could figure out that Bob was trying to screw me over by about $1.6 million. I politely declined his generous offer and started screening my phone calls more carefully. My brother Tim was a different kind of problem altogether. He showed up at my apartment unannounced one evening, carrying a 6-pack of beer and wearing a serious face. Tim had never been good at hiding his emotions, and I could see the mixture of excitement and resentment written all over him. "So," he said, settling into my only decent chair. My little brother's about to be a millionaire. That's something. I cracked open a beer and waited for whatever was really on his mind. Tim had a way of working up to the point of a conversation, like a pitcher warming up for a fastball. You know, he continued, family's supposed to look out for each other. When one of us does well, we all do well. That's how Dad raised us. There it was. Tim wanted his cut of my space rock windfall, and he was wrapping it up in family loyalty to make it sound reasonable. The same guy who'd spent months telling everyone I was an embarrassment to the Miller name now wanted to be my partner in prosperity. What exactly are you suggesting, Tim? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. He launched into this whole speech about how we could invest the money together. Maybe start a business. Help each other out the way brothers should. It all sounded very noble until you remembered that Tim had been perfectly happy to let me struggle alone when I had nothing to offer him. I thought about something Grandpa used to say. Wealth isn't what's in your pocket, it's what's in your heart. Tim was proving that some people had poverty in both places, regardless of how much money was involved. The pressure was getting intense from all directions. Former co-workers were calling to congratulate me and hint about loans they needed. Distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly interested in reconnecting. Even the pastor from the church I'd tried attending started dropping by to discuss the spiritual obligations that came with unexpected wealth. Everyone had an opinion about what I should do with my meteorite money, and most of those opinions involved giving them some of it. It was like being a winner of a lottery where everyone else thought they deserved to share the prize just for knowing you. But the more people pushed me to make quick decisions, the more I found myself thinking about what Grandpa would have done. He'd always been deliberate about important choices, taking time to consider all the angles before committing to anything. Good decisions, he used to say, are like good wine. They need time to develop properly. After a week of constant pressure from family, friends, and total strangers, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called the University of Chicago and asked to speak with Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter, I said when he came on the line, I've been thinking about that meteorite, and I'd like to make a donation to your museum. Not the whole thing, but maybe some pieces of it. Enough so kids can see what came from outer space and maybe get inspired to look up at the stars. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Miller, that's incredibly generous, but are you sure? Those pieces could be worth a considerable amount of money. I thought about all the times Grandpa Al had taken me to the pier to look at the stars reflected in the lake water. How he told me stories about ancient civilizations who used those same stars to navigate across oceans. How he'd said that the best treasures were the ones you could share with other people. I'm sure, I told Dr. Carter. My grandfather always said the best things in life were worth sharing. I figure some kid sees those crystals and decides to become an astronomer or a geologist because of it. That's worth more than any money I could get for them. Dr. Carter was practically speechless. Apparently, people don't usually call up universities offering to donate pieces of million-dollar meteorites. He arranged for a specialist to come to Saugatuck and carefully extract some specimens that could be displayed without compromising the main piece. The auction went ahead as planned 3 weeks later. I didn't attend in person. The whole circus atmosphere wasn't really my style, but Sarah from Christie's called me with updates as the bidding progressed. 2 collectors got into a serious bidding war over my space rock, driving the price higher than anyone had expected. When the gavel finally came down, my meteorite had sold for $1.5 million. After Christie's took their commission and the government took its share in taxes, I was left with just over $1.3 million, more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. That evening, I drove out to the pier where this whole adventure had started. The auction check was folded up in my wallet, representing more financial security than 3 generations of Millers had ever possessed. But sitting there on Grandpa's old pier, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and orange, I felt something more valuable than money. I felt proud of the choices I'd made. Emily could keep her lawyer friend and her regrets. Tim could find his own way to success without expecting a handout from his embarrassing little brother. Bob Patterson could go back to selling overpriced cars to people who actually needed them. Fred and Mike found me there as the stars started coming out, carrying their usual coffee and quiet wisdom. They didn't ask about the money or the auction or what I planned to do next. They just shared their coffee and watched the water, the way friends do when words aren't necessary. You know what the best part about catching a big fish is? Fred asked eventually, his voice carrying across the still water. What's that? I replied, though I had a feeling I already knew where he was going with this. It's not the size of the fish, he said. It's knowing you had the patience to wait for it, and the wisdom to know what to do with it once you caught it. Mike nodded and added one of his Hemingway quotes. The real noble thing is to be worthy of the good things that happen to you. Sitting there with my friends, looking out at the lake that had given me so much more than just a meteorite, I realized that Grandpa, I would have been proud. Not because of the money, but because I'd managed to stay true to the person he'd helped raise. The space rock had been incredible, worth more money than I'd ever imagined. But the real treasure was simpler than that. It was a knowledge that when life handed me an opportunity to become someone different, someone greedy or bitter or cruel, I'd chosen to remain myself instead. As I sat there on the pier, I thought about what Grandpa would say about all this. The real treasure isn't what you find, Jack. It's what you do with it that shows who you really are. And for the first time since Emily had left that note on our kitchen counter, I felt like I knew exactly who that was. Having over $1 million in the bank is a strange feeling when you spent most of your adult life worrying about whether you can afford groceries. For the first few weeks after the auction, I kept checking my account balance like it might disappear if I didn't keep an eye on it. But gradually, I started thinking less about the money itself and more about what I wanted to do with it. The first thing I bought was something I'd been dreaming about since Emily and I used to share those Tom Petty cassettes on our back porch. A house by the lake. Not some mansion that would make the neighbors uncomfortable, but a modest place with a good view of the water and enough space for a workshop. The kind of house Grandpa I would have approved of, where you could watch the sunrise with your coffee and hear the waves from your bedroom window. It was a 1970s ranch house about 2 miles from town, sitting on 3 acres with 200 feet of lakefront. The previous owners had let it get a little run down, but the bones were solid, and I'd learned enough about fixing things during my years of making do with less. Most importantly, it felt like home the moment I walked through the front door. But buying a house was just the beginning. I kept thinking about all those months I spent standing in unemployment lines, watching good people lose hope as their benefits ran out and job prospects dried up. The memory of that desperation stayed with me, and I knew I wanted to do something about it. I set up what I called the Second Chance Fund, a nonprofit that provided small grants and job training assistance to people who'd lost their jobs due to plant closures or economic downturns. Nothing huge, just enough to help folks keep their heads above water while they figured out their next move. I remembered how alone I'd felt during those dark months, and I wanted to make sure other people knew someone was in their corner. The fund started small, helping maybe a dozen people in its first year. But word spread to the network of unemployment offices and community centers, and soon we were assisting families throughout Southwest Michigan. It felt good to take some of the money that had come from outer space and use it to help people right here on Earth. The bigger investment was something that combined my newfound passion for fishing with my need to stay busy. I'd been spending so much time at tackle shops over the past year that I'd started noticing how many of them were run by people who clearly didn't fish themselves. They'd sell you the most expensive rod in the store, whether it was right for what you wanted to catch or not. I found a small retail space in downtown Saugatuck that had been empty since the hardware store next door expanded. The rent was reasonable, and it was close enough to the lake that serious fishermen would find eventually. I called it Grandpa's Knot in honor of all those patient afternoons when he'd taught me that a good knot holds stronger than any promise. The shop had everything a real fisherman needed: quality rods and reels, locally tied flies, tackle that actually worked instead of just looking flashy. But what made it special was the atmosphere. I installed speakers that played classic rock from the 70s and 80s, kept a pot of decent coffee brewing, and made sure the place smelled like cedar and possibility instead of plastic and desperation. Most importantly, I hired people who actually knew what they were talking about. My first employee was Dave Henderson, one of my old coworkers from the John Deere plant who'd been struggling to find steady work since the closure. Dave had been fishing Lake Michigan since he was 8 years old and could tell you exactly which lure to use based on the weather, water temperature, and what the fish had been eating that week. The second hire was unexpected, but perfect. Sarah Collins had worked in the accounting department at the plant, handling payroll and benefits for 300 employees. She was 35, recently divorced, and looking for a fresh start that didn't involve sitting in a cubicle all day. When she came in asking about a part-time bookkeeping position, I ended up offering her a full partnership in running the business side of things. Sarah turned out to be exactly what the shop needed. She understood numbers in a way that made my head spin, but she also got the culture of fishing, the patience, the respect for nature, the quiet satisfaction of doing something well. She'd grown up fishing with her father on inland lakes and took to Lake Michigan fishing like she'd been born to it. Working together every day, it was probably inevitable that Sarah and I would develop feelings for each other. Both of us had been through difficult divorces. Both of us were cautious about rushing into anything. But there was an easy compatibility between us that reminded me of the best parts of my relationship with Emily without any of the drama. Sarah laughed at my terrible jokes about fishing lures, helped me expand the business without losing its soul, and had this way of making even the most difficult customers feel like valued friends. When she suggested we start carrying locally made fishing rods alongside the mass-produced ones, sales jumped 20% in 2 months. A year after we'd opened, on a quiet Tuesday evening when we were closing up the shop together, I asked Sarah if she'd like to make our partnership official in more ways than one. She said yes before I'd even finished the question, and we were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the pier where this whole adventure had started. The business grew faster than either of us had expected. Grandpa's Knot became the go-to place for serious fishermen throughout the region, not because we had the lowest prices, but because we treated fishing like the art form is instead of just another consumer activity. People would drive 2 hours just to talk tackle with Dave, or get Sarah's advice on planning a fishing trip to the Upper Peninsula. By our 3rd year, we'd open a second location in Holland, Michigan, followed by shops in Milwaukee and Chicago. Each location maintained the same philosophy: hire people who actually fish, stock quality gear that works, and create an atmosphere where fishermen feel like they're among friends rather than customers. I made sure to hire former factory workers whenever possible, people who understood the value of honest work and treating customers with respect. Mike, the Vietnam vet from the pier, became our manager in Milwaukee after he decided to settle down somewhere with a real address. Fred consulted on our selection of vintage tackle, turning his lifetime of fishing knowledge into a second career. 5 years after finding that meteorite, we had 6 Grandpa's Knot locations across 3 states, with annual revenues approaching $3.5 million. Not bad for a guy who'd started with nothing but a space rock and a dream of helping people catch fish. But the real satisfaction wasn't the numbers. It was in the letters we received from customers whose kids had caught their first fish using gear from our shops, or from families who discovered that fishing together was the best therapy for whatever problems they were facing. We become part of people's stories, part of their traditions, part of the way they connected with each other and with the natural world. Sarah and I lived in a house by the lake, where we could walk down to our own stretch of shoreline every evening and cast a line into the same water where I'd found my fortune. Our marriage was everything my relationship with Emily hadn't been, built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep friendship that makes even ordinary moments feel special. We talked about having kids someday, maybe adopting an older child who needed a second chance the way both of us had gotten second chances. There was something appealing about the idea of teaching a kid to fish on the same pier where Grandpa Al had taught me, passing along not just the technical skills, but the patience and perspective that come with spending quiet time by moving water. The success of the business also meant I could expand the Second Chance Fund beyond its original scope. We started offering small business loans to people who wanted to start their own companies, job training programs in partnership with community colleges, and emergency assistance for families facing unexpected crises. It felt good to know that the money from my space rock was creating opportunities for other people to rebuild their lives. Not everyone was happy about my success, of course. Tim still occasionally called with investment opportunities that would benefit him more than me, and I'd learned to politely decline while changing the subject to something safer. Some of the local businessmen who tried to lowball me for the meteorite seemed to take my prosperity as a personal insult, but that was their problem to solve, not mine. The letter from Emily arrived on a Tuesday, delivered to the shop rather than my home address. Sarah brought it to me with raised eyebrows, recognizing the name from stories I told about my first marriage. The envelope was expensive stationery, the kind Emily had always used for thank you notes and invitations when we were married. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in Emily's careful handwriting. I made a mistake, Jack. No explanation, no request of forgiveness, no suggestion that we should try again. Just an acknowledgement that she'd chosen poorly when she decided to leave me for her lawyer friend. I showed the letter to Sarah, who read it and handed it back with a thoughtful expression. She didn't say anything negative about Emily. Sarah was too classy for that, but I could see in her eyes that she understood how much the timing of this apology meant. Emily was reaching out now that I was successful, not when I'd needed support the most. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I first examined my meteorite, though everything else in my life had changed completely, and wrote a reply. I kept it simple. Just one line that seemed to capture everything I'd learned about treasure hunting, both in space rocks and in life. Treasures are found by those who aren't afraid to dig deep. I mailed it the next day and never heard from Emily again, which was exactly what I'd hoped would happen. Some chapters of your life need to stay closed once you've moved on to better things. The success of Grandpa's knot had exceeded my wildest expectations, but it also taught me something important about the difference between luck and wisdom. Finding the meteorite had been pure chance, being in the right place at the right time with enough curiosity to investigate something unusual. But building a business, maintaining a marriage, creating something of lasting value, that took the kind of patient persistence Grandpa had tried to teach me all those years ago. These days, I start most mornings the same way I did during those difficult months after losing my job, by driving out to the old pier with a cup of coffee and my fishing gear. The difference is that now I'm fishing with equipment from my own store, in a truck that starts on the first try, secure in the knowledge that I built something meaningful with the opportunity that fell from the sky. Fred still shows up most mornings, though he's officially retired now and spends his time teaching fishing classes for kids through a program we sponsor. Mike splits his time between the Milwaukee store and his old spot on the pier, still quoting Hemingway and making those incredible sandwiches. We become the kind of old friends who don't need to talk to enjoy each other's company. Sarah joins me on weekend mornings when the shop is closed, bringing her own gear and the kind of quiet confidence that makes even the fish seem more cooperative. We've learned each other's rhythms on the water, developed our own shorthand for communication, created the kind of partnership that makes both of us better at everything we do. Sometimes tourists recognize me as a guy who found the $1 million meteorite, and they want to hear the whole story. I'm always happy to tell it, though I usually emphasize the parts about persistence and community more than the parts about sudden wealth. The real lesson isn't that space rocks fall from the sky. It's that good things come to people who show up consistently and pay attention to what's around them. Last week, a young couple stopped by the shop with their 8-year-old son, who was fascinated by the story of a meteorite. The kid wanted to know if there might be more space rocks hiding around Lake Michigan, just waiting for someone to find them. I told him there probably were, but that the best treasure hunters were the ones who enjoyed the search itself, not just the discovery at the end. Standing there in my shop, surrounded by the tools and atmosphere I created to honor my grandfather's memory, watching that kid's eyes light up with possibility, I realized I'd found something more valuable than any meteorite. I'd found a way to turn an accident of cosmic timing into a legacy that might outlast me. This evening, like most evenings, I'm sitting on the pier where everything started, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan with a fishing rod from Grandpa's knot in my hands. The rod is perfectly balanced. The line is strong enough to handle whatever might bite, and the bait is fresh enough to make even the pickiest fish interested. But honestly, whether I catch anything tonight isn't really the point anymore. I'm here because this is where I learned that patience and persistence eventually pay off, where I discovered that the best treasures are often the ones you weren't looking for, where I figured out that success isn't just about what you achieve, but about who you become in the process. The water is calm tonight. reflecting the first stars like tiny diamonds scattered across black velvet. In a few minutes, Sarah will join me with her own rod and a thermos of that good coffee she makes. We'll sit together in comfortable silence, listening to the waves and waiting to see what the lake might offer up tonight. Life is like a lake. I've learned you never know what's hiding beneath the surface, but if you're willing to cast your line and wait patiently, it will eventually reveal its secrets. Sometimes you catch small fish, sometimes you find space rocks, and sometimes you discover that the real treasure was in the casting and waiting all along. As the stars come out over Lake Michigan, reflecting in the same water that gave me a second chance at everything, I can almost hear Grandpa El's voice carried on the evening breeze. Keep that line in the water, Jackie. You never know when the big one's going to bite.